Welcome to the deep dive. So today, we're going back to August 5th, 2011. It was the day the world's most powerful economy basically got publicly shamed.
Yeah.
The day America lost its perfect, pristine AAA credit rating.
A status it had held for 94 years. I mean, since Moody's first assigned it way back in 1917.
So this wasn't just another financial headline. This was a political earthquake.
Oh, it was truly seismic. For nearly a century, U.S. debt was the unquestioned global standard of safety. Period.
And then S&P drops it from AAA to AA plus debt.
The historic weight of that was just staggering. But here's the puzzle we're going to try and solve for you today. The U.S. was downgraded not because it couldn't pay its bills,
Right.
but because its political system proved itself, well, functionally unstable.
Okay, let's unpack that, because our mission here is to get into this huge paradox. The rating agencies judged America incapable of governing itself, a judgment on governance, not economics.
Yes.
And yet, the market's response was completely counterintuitive. I mean, if an asset is suddenly declared riskier, investors should run away, right?
You'd think so. And S&P's own reasoning makes it crystal clear where they laid the blame.
Yeah.
It wasn't about GDP or trade deficits. They said, and I'm quoting here, the political brinksmanship of recent months highlights what we see as America's governance and policymaking becoming less stable, less effective, and less predictable.
Wow, that is a harsh judgment.
It is.
They were essentially saying, look, you have the money to pay, we know that. We just don't trust the people holding the checkbook to actually agree to sign the check.
It was a qualitative assessment of institutional failure. S&P was signaling that the political foundation of the entire economy was cracking.
So they were measuring the willingness to govern, not the ability to print money.
Precisely. And if the rating agency is screaming, danger, why did the market basically just shrug?
That's the great paradox. But I guess we can't understand the reaction without first digging into the political trigger.
Well, the trigger was the 2011 debt ceiling crisis. For decades, the debt ceiling, the legal limit on how much debt the Treasury can issue, was a routine thing.
Just an administrative formality.
Yeah, they raised it 74 times since 1960, often with no drama at all.
But 2011 was different. The 2010 midterms had ushered in the Tea Party wave, and the new Republican majority, led by Speaker John Boehner, decided to weaponize it.
They did. They introduced what became known as the Boehner Rule,
which demanded dollar-for-dollar spending cuts for every single dollar the debt ceiling was increased.
It forced this huge national negotiation over something that had always been routine.
And that led to those infamous grand bargain talks, the $4 trillion deal between President Obama and Speaker Boehner.
This was the moment Washington almost fixed its long-term debt problems. I mean, the deal was monumental. Deep entitlement reforms, massive spending caps.
And crucially, tax revenue increases.
Right, and that's where it all fell apart. It collapsed on July 22, 2011.
And the reason it collapsed illustrates the very dysfunction S&P was worried about. Even with historic spending cuts on the table, the House Republican faction just refused to accept any new revenue. Any at all.
They preferred walking right up to the brink of a national default over compromising on taxes.
So that failure left Congress with just days before the Treasury would technically run out of borrowing authority.
They scrambled. They passed the Budget Control Act on August 2nd, averting default. But S&P was watching the numbers.
They had made their position clear, hadn't they?
Very clear. They wanted $4 trillion in long-term savings to keep that AAA rating.
And the BCA.
It delivered only $2.1 trillion over a decade.
And even those cuts weren't really guaranteed, were they? A huge part of that relied on sequestration.
Right.
For anyone who's forgotten that wonderful term, what did that actually mean? Why did S&P hate it so much?
Sequestration just meant automatic, across-the-board punitive cuts. For defense, for domestic programs, everything. S&P saw it as highly unpredictable. I mean, it's a terrible way to govern. It injects constant uncertainty. It's a sign of legislative failure, not fiscal discipline.
And yet, the politicians were declaring victory. Speaker Boehner famously said, "I got 98% of what I wanted."
That quote just perfectly captures the dissonance, doesn't it? A political win is being declared at the exact moment a rating agency is calling the whole system a failure.
And the drama just kept going right up to the announcement. On August 5th, Treasury officials were in these frantic talks with S&P.
They were claiming S&P had made a massive, quote, $2 trillion mathematical error in their debt projections.
A $2 trillion error. That sounds like it should be a game changer.
You would absolutely think so. And S&P reviewed the data. They admitted the calculation error on the baseline was real, and they corrected their models. But, and this is the critical pivot, they stood by the AAA plus rating anyway. They explicitly said the math correction would not affect the AAA plus rating.
Well, that settles it then. It confirms the downgrade wasn't about the numbers on the page. It was about the credibility of the institution itself.
Exactly. They were saying, okay, we fixed your math, but you still failed the competency test.
Which brings us right back to that great paradox. The markets get this definitive news. The U.S. political system is broken. And they respond in this completely bizarre way.
Completely counterintuitive.
Let's look at that Monday, August 8th, 2011. First trading day after the news. The reaction was split, right?
Totally bifurcated. The stock market did exactly what you'd expect. Panic.
The S&P 500 crashed 6.7%.
The biggest single-day drop since the 2008 financial crisis. Investors were fleeing risk assets everywhere.
But here's the twist. Where did all that panic money go?
It ran straight into U.S. Treasuries, the very asset that S&P had just labeled as being riskier.
The debt market had a massive historic rally. Treasury yields, which move opposite to prices, they just fell off a cliff.
The 10-year yield dropped 122 basis points in the next few weeks, from almost 3% down to 1.7%. Prices soared.
And not only that, the U.S. dollar got stronger, and the euro against the pound.
So this is the core question for every global investor. Why would you flee to the asset that was just downgraded?
So, reason number one is the flight to safety. But I have to ask, how can you be the world's safe haven if the referee just told everyone you're less safe? It's a contradiction.
It is, but it's the definition of being the cleanest dirty shirt. Yes, the U.S. had political risks, but the alternatives, they were facing existential crises.
You're talking about the Eurozone.
Absolutely. The sovereign debt crisis in Europe, Greece, Portugal, Spain, it was escalating dramatically. So compared to the real possibility of the euro collapsing, the U.S., even with its political drama, looked pretty good.
That's a key distinction. You're comparing political incompetence to, well, potential currency fragmentation.
Right. But the second reason for the rally, regulatory override, this is maybe the most fascinating part. It showed that S&P's opinion didn't matter to the institutions that really count.
What do you mean?
Within hours of the downgrade, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, all the bank regulators, they issued joint guidance.
And they said?
They ruled that U.S. Treasuries would continue to get the same 0% risk waiting for capital rules as before.
So for a bank, even if S&P says it's AA plus A, the regulators are mandating that you treat it as if it's still AAA risk-free.
Exactly. It preserved the status quo. It basically neutralized S&P's financial impact on the entire banking system.
And then there's the third reason, the ultimate trump card that keeps everyone trapped. Tiana.
There is no alternative. The sheer size, the depth, the liquidity of the U.S. debt market, it's just unparalleled.
Global finance needs the dollar.
It runs on the dollar. Look at China, the biggest foreign holder of U.S. debt. Their state news agency, Xinhua, criticized the U.S. as an addicted borrower that needed international supervision.
Strong words.
Very. But they're stuck. They had to keep buying U.S. debt to manage their own currency.
If they sold it, they'd crash the value of their own reserves.
They destroy themselves. Their economic model requires them to keep feeding the U.S. debt machine no matter how dysfunctional Washington gets.
So the U.S. loses its credit rating, but not its financial dominance.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there.
Not at all.
The government, fresh from being publicly shamed, immediately pivots. And we enter what some call the retaliation narrative.
The fallout for S&P was incredibly fast.
Mm-hmm.
The CEO, Devin Sharma, resigned just 18 days after the downgrade.
18 days.
But the more aggressive move came for the government itself.
The timing on this is, well, it's pretty conspicuous. Shortly after the downgrade, the DOJ and the SEC announced an investigation into S&P.
An investigation for its role in the 2008 mortgage crisis. You know, a crisis that happened 3 years earlier.
And that culminated in a massive $5 billion fraud lawsuit against S&P in 2013.
S&P blasted it.
Yeah.
They called it clear retaliation for the downgrade. And it's hard to dismiss that claim when you see who wasn't sued.
Moody's and Fitch, who kept the AAA rating.
They faced no such scrutiny. And it wasn't just S&P. A smaller agency, Egan-Jones, was actually the first to downgrade the U.S. back in July 2011.
And what happened to them?
They were subsequently barred from rating government securities by the SEC. The message was pretty clear. Downgrade the U.S. government, and there will be consequences.
But the real question is, did anyone learn a lesson? Did this public shaming force any change?
Spoiler alert, no. The dysfunction that S&P pointed to in 2011 only got worse. Washington just hit the snooze button and ran up an even bigger tab.
We saw the pattern just repeat itself. 2 more downgrades.
First, Fitch. In August 2023, they followed S&P, and for the exact same reasons. Deterioration in standards of governance. They even privately cited the January 6th insurrection as a governance concern.
And then the final pillar fell. Moody's, the last holdout, finally gave in May of 2025, downgraded the U.S. to AA1.
And that's historically significant. For the first time in over a century, the U.S. holds no AAA rating from any major agency.
Look at the debt. In 2011, when S&P hit the panic button, the national debt was about $14.4 trillion.
And by 2025, it's over $36 trillion.
The consequence wasn't just losing a letter grade, it was a $22 trillion increase in debt.
And here's the ultimate irony. The market reaction got more muted with each downgrade.
Investors are just desensitized. The political dysfunction premium is just absorbed into the system.
Which brings us back to that core distinction. Rating agencies are measuring two things: ability to pay and willingness to pay.
And the U.S.'s ability to pay is almost unlimited, right? Because it's a sovereign currency issuer. It can't involuntarily go bankrupt in its own currency.
Exactly. So S&P's downgrade in 2011, and the ones from Fitch and Moody's later, they were fundamentally a judgment on willingness to govern. They measured institutional health.
While the market was measuring something else entirely.
The market measures alternatives and liquidity.
So what does this all mean for you, trying to make sense of the global economy? The risk isn't that the dollar is going to collapse tomorrow.
No.
The risk is that the world starts viewing the U.S. less like a stable institution and more like a rich, talented person who just keeps threatening to burn down their own house every few years. Is that a fair analogy?
That is a perfect analogy. The real cumulative risk is the slow erosion of the soft power of the dollar. The trust, the reliability, the institutional competence.
The 2011 event proved that U.S. debt is a political asset first and an economic asset second.
That's the essential takeaway. Rating agencies are measuring governance. Markets are measuring the lack of viable alternatives. TAA.
The U.S. lost its AAA because of how it governs. It kept its market dominance because of what it is.
And those two facts have coexisted for over a decade now. It just shows the incredible depth of borrowed credibility the U.S. still has.
So think about this as you watch the next political standoff unfold. How many warnings from S&P in 2011, Fitch in 2023, and Moody's in 2025 does a nation get before that borrowed credibility finally runs out? What would it actually take for there is no alternative to finally fail? That's the multi-trillion-dollar question.